And several members of Congress in both parties questioned the legality of President Donald Trump's move on Saturday to launch military strikes on Iran, and talks of impeachment have been starting to get louder. We're now going to take a more comprehensive look into the fast-moving and volatile situation in the Middle East with our news director, David Clement, who joins me now. Now, David, there has been an uproar in the fact that the president didn't seek congressional approval before the strikes were made over the weekend. What are lawmakers saying about the legality of that decision?
Well, the legality really rests on the interpretation of Article 2 in the US Constitution, which deems that not only is the president the commander in chief of the armed forces, that he also has the discretion to order military engagements for the purpose of national defense. And so that is really where the crux of this debate is this a defensive act or not? Now, in the 70s, I believe 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which required the president to notify Congress up to 48 hours in advance of any such type of military engagement. The Trump administration did do that. Although the timeline is a little gray, it may have actually happened as the bombing campaign was happening. But really, a lot of it just rests on the interpretation of Article 2 and whether or not there was an imminent threat posed by Iran. It's also important to highlight here that the legality is in question because there are a lot of precedents already set and established going back from 1800 onward to the last Trump administration, where, for example, in his first term, a bombing campaign killed an IRGC, an Iranian general, Soleimani, who was in Iraq at the time. The Obama administration had used drones to kill Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, both of whom were American citizens, as well as Obama bombing campaigns in Libya. Those didn't have congressional approval either. And I mean, if you rewind the clock back to essentially the beginning of the United States, in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson sent the Navy off for its first foreign mission in North Africa without notifying Congress until after they were far enough that they couldn't be recalled. And so it really comes down to the interpretation of Article 2 and what the commander in chief is allowed to do and whether or not it counts as a defensive action or an action against an imminent threat to protect national security.
So, on that, is impeachment talk in this situation valid or even achievable?
Probably not. So it's important to remember that impeachment trials really have nothing to do with whether or not this was legal. It's all about where members of Congress and then the Senate vote. So the Republicans hold control of Congress. So it would be highly unlikely for enough Republicans to break ranks and vote with the Democrats to push this over the line to get it to the Senate. Very unlikely because MAGA still controls the Republican Party. Many of these people are up for primaries in the coming years. The majority of Republican voters support the president's actions. And even if it did get to the Senate, and let's say you had someone like Rand Paul vote with the Democrats, you'd most likely have somebody like John Fetterman from Pennsylvania vote with the Republicans because he's been a fairly strident supporter of Israel. And so it's very, very unlikely that any attempt at impeachment goes anywhere based on the makeup of the House and the Senate right now.
So, what separates a defensive military action from one that requires congressional authorization?
That is a great question that is largely unknown right now. I think the optics of this will really rest on two things. So the news has just broke that the congressional briefing for the Senate and members of Congress has been postponed. That was supposed to be the attempt to basically show members of Congress and the Senate what's behind the curtain and what the U.S. was acting on. That's been postponed. We don't know when that's going to be rescheduled. If it isn't rescheduled optically, that would look really bad for the administration because it would give off the appearance that they're maybe trying to withhold information. There's also another piece of news that just broke, which is a leaked intelligence report that CNN has just reported saying that the bombing campaign did not actually destroy all of the centrifuges in Iran. And so it will, those are the two big questions of, are members of Congress going to see the information the administration was acting on? And are there going to be other intelligence reports that come out that maybe contradict these early reports? Because it is still early. You have to remember that there are no other third parties who've gone in to see whether or not it's actually been destroyed. There are assumptions that are being made. And so it's really hard to know what the totality of the damage is, and if it's set Iran back a matter of months, or if it's destroyed the capability for them to pursue a bomb entirely.
Well, and on that, on these new reports that are coming out, what has been the reaction? There was a ceasefire that was proposed yesterday by Donald Trump, but with new reports coming out, how are people reacting to this?
Yeah, I mean, prior to the report that maybe the bombing campaign didn't work, I mean, you also have to note that these bombs or ordinances had never actually been used in combat before. So it's new technology. So in many instances, we're just taking the administration's word for it. The reaction from Democrats right now is further evidence that this wasn't worth the risk. But if the ceasefire does hold, and if the centrifuges were destroyed and Iran can no longer pursue nuclear weapons, it would be a huge foreign policy win for Donald Trump. And it would be a huge foreign policy win because every administration going back to Reagan has wanted to stop Iran from having the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. They've had plans to carry out this type of bombing for years. And so if it worked, Donald Trump could have accomplished what several of his predecessors would have, in theory, wanted to do but couldn't, and done so without endangering the lives of any American soldiers, and certainly not having anyone be injured or killed in action.
Right. But David, on that, what gives the U.S. the authority to make the decision for who gets nuclear weapons and who doesn't? Why is the U.S. in charge of making that decision?
Because they're the global power. It's crude, but it's the way the world works. If we were having this conversation 200 years ago, it would be the British who would be the decision makers on some of these major things. When it comes to nuclear bombs, I'll use Russia and Ukraine as an example. The entirety of that war, Russia's invasion and the response from allies of Ukraine, has been entirely clouded by Vladimir Putin suggesting, using innuendo, that he obviously has nuclear weapons, but that he would maybe use them. And so wanting to prevent a regime like that from acquiring nuclear weapons is ultimately the end goal, because once you have them, it is, pardon the pun, I guess, the trump card in terms of geopolitics and warfare. I mean, if you look at North Korea, a horrific regime that starves its own people, that's a pariah state, basically every bad name you could think of is a descriptor for North Korea. The reason why nothing can be done about North Korea is because it is believed that they have nuclear weapons and would be willing to use them. And so the world just kind of has to keep their hands off.
Well, for the world to keep their hands off, I mean, the idea of a nuclear weapon is for a country to use it for defense, not against another country. But to go back to what I just asked, why would the United States be the country to be making this decision when they're the only country to have ever used a nuclear weapon against another country during World War II?
So, I mean, they would be the only ones because they're the biggest dog in the yard. They make the rules. The analogy would be they're the tough kid at recess, and they get to make the rules because they're the biggest and the strongest. And if I were to make an argument in defense of the world order and the way in which it is now, the alternative would be much worse. The alternative would be China determining the rules of the game at the global scale. It would be Russia determining the rules of the game at the global scale. Whether it has merits or it has its faults, it's right or it's wrong, I think geopolitically, the consensus is if there's going to be a captain driving the ship, it's better, generally speaking, to have the Americans driving the ship than the alternatives.
All right. Well, David, thank you for the time today.
Thank you.